Every day, there's a battle for your mind raging. Information coming from every angle with the will to deceive. Fear not. You found the place for truth. The voice of a generation that still has the will to believe in the greatest country in the history of the world. This is the Charlie Kirk Show. Buckle up. Here we go.
Okay, everybody, radio stations across the country, honored to be with you as always, live from the Imperial Capital here in Washington, D.C. We're here at the mobilebitcoin.com studio. You can email us, freedom@charliekirk.com, and subscribe to the Charlie Kirk Show podcast. The Charlie Kirk Show podcast is doing quite well right now as we check the numbers, number 8 overall in Apple News. We're going to get straight to a guest here about many different things, and I love this idea of just doing things, cleaning up our cities, amongst many other topics that we are going to cover. The guest is Auren McIntyre. He's a serious thinker, BlazeTV host, and author of The Total State. Auren, great to see you. Welcome to the Charlie Kirk Show.
Thanks for having me, Charlie.
So, Auren, you have, why don't we take this, before we get into some of the stories of the day, it's your first time on the program, I believe. Introduce yourself. Who are you? What do you believe? And what do you do?
I'm Auren McIntyre. I've got the Auren McIntyre Show over at BlazeTV. I'm somebody who spent a lot of time just as an average guy. I was a high school teacher. I did a little bit of reporting for a local newspaper. And I started studying a lot more about political theory once I saw what happened during COVID, all the insane violations of our rights, because I needed to understand what was actually going on. I started making videos and talking about that, and that's really how I got to what I'm doing today.
So speaking of kind of the structure and the form of government, let's dive into some of the news of the day. President Donald Trump has announced that there's going to be a federal takeover of Washington, D.C. We have long said that crime is a choice, that rampant crime and the kind of degeneration of America's greatest cities has been a conscious decision by our political leaders. Has there been a comparable example in history or even in modern Western times of a great power deciding to no longer be great? And your thoughts on the federalization of Washington, D.C. as President Donald Trump uses federal force to clean up our nation's capital?
I think it's a constant feature of declining societies, especially declining empires, that they lose the will to make the hard choices, that decisions become increasingly difficult because everyone wants to avoid accountability and responsibility. Laws get put into place just to protect the criminals because ultimately it's fear of the process that people worry about, not the fear of the actual crime. The people who are being victimized are put below the others. Their rights are less important than the rights of the criminal. I think that what we're seeing with Donald Trump right now is the willingness to say, no, law and order is what matters. The safety of the American people is what matters. And we're not going to let a bunch of soft on crime laws and everybody else who's trying to put all of these barriers between us and keeping the people safe. We're going to start ignoring those. We have the authority to do so. The Constitution grants Congress the ultimate legislative authority over Washington, D.C. It was never supposed to be its own city with its own political interests, and it certainly wasn't supposed to increase crime by putting these type of soft on crime policies in place. I think a lot of people have been waiting for moves like this from Donald Trump, and they're very encouraged to see him taking this kind of action.
Of course, the press is up in arms over all of it. And it's not that crime is hard to stop. It's that it's mildly unpleasant to stop. And we have decided that if some groups will go to prison more often than others, then it's just not worth having real laws.
Yeah, Charlie, that's what reflected.
Yeah, please, Auren, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, just that we see that reflected all over our society, that ultimately what people are worried about more is offense than actual safety. And so over and over again, we see people choosing not to offend certain groups, to placate certain politically correct theories about how society works, as opposed to look at how society is really working and taking action. And so a lot of people will notice, for instance, that certain groups, such as Black Americans, often commit higher crimes, but it is unfashionable to admit this, and noticing that more of these people would go to jail should people be actually arrested and the law enforced means that we have to pull back on the actual crime enforcement. And I believe you've talked to Steve Saylor about this kind of impact that we see over again from kind of the perceptions our society has about how we should treat crime. And this is ultimately damaging people. So once again, like you said, we know how to solve this problem. It's not that crime is a mystery. We know what works, but we simply chose not to enforce it because ultimately crime is a policy choice. You can choose between actually enforcing the law and keeping people safe and having a free and equal society in which you understand that ultimately some groups who commit more crimes may end up in jail more often, or you can play, this game of obfuscating what's actually going on, being soft on these policies, ultimately hurting the very people who are contributing to society, just so you can please a bunch of people who ultimately probably aren't voting, aren't contributing, aren't being involved in the body politic anyway.
Mike Cernovich had a phenomenal tweet last evening where MSNBC's up in arms and they're saying, oh, this is just a bunch of lies. DC, the crime is coming down. Understand, it's down from record highs post-2020, but it's not down of where it was 20 years ago. But this is an open offer, and Cernovich was exactly right. For any member of the press, this shows the fraud that they are. Why don't you go walk the Navy Yard with a GoPro at midnight, no armed security, no weapons, and live stream what you see? Why don't you go walk the Navy Yard, MSNBC, any one of these members of the press? You don't get any armored cars, no police support. Just walk the streets. Show us how safe they are. And then, by the way, you'll get big ratings. Expose the president's lies. I could walk the streets of Tokyo at night. When I walk the streets of Tokyo, there will be no thugs or gangbangers, criminal members. All these members of the press, this is the key, they live in Northern Virginia or Maryland. Why don't they just live over the Anacostia River? It's a lot closer to where they work. And of course, the key element of this is they're big talkers, but they even know how wildly undangerous Washington, D.C. has come. You mentioned something such as disparate impact. Auren, do you believe this idea of disparate impact, that more black people might go to jail if you're tough on crime? Is that one of the modern original sins as to why we have allowed the country to descend into a more dangerous and at times third world unrecognizable environment?
Oh, absolutely. And people have to understand that this is actually encoded into our law. The Civil Rights Act originally was implemented with the idea that, of course, we wanted equal treatment for people of all races in the United States. But what quickly happened is that the courts developed this doctrine of disparate impact, and the idea that if there's ever any difference between group outcomes, whether it be education or crime or anything else, that the only answer to that different result is racism. It's de facto racism. Even if you didn't mean to be racist, it means that you are racist. And this doctrine impacts everything in our society. The Sheetz gas station lost a lawsuit against the federal government last year. They brought a civil rights lawsuit against this gas station because it was excluding people from employment due to background checks. And more often than not, background checks that exclude people were excluding more black and other minority members during the selection process. So even though it was just a background check for criminal activity, because it disproportionately produced results that kept Black Americans from getting jobs there, they lost the lawsuit. They were in violation of the Civil Rights Act. And this attitude impacts everything, our policing, our schools. I used to be a public school teacher. I was in a majority minority school. And in that school, it was made very clear that we could not discipline or fail our students because they were minority students, and disproportionately, that would show that we were racist, even though they were the majority of the student body. And it would simply make sense that more minority students were going to be failed or expelled in that environment. It didn't matter. So this doesn't just affect crime in D.C. This affects how your child is educated in the public school down the street.
The Civil Rights Act was a new founding where we decided to discard the U.S. Constitution and reconstitute the story, the mantra, the creed, and the vision of America. And you even see this in Republican circles as well. Well, they say, well, the Civil Rights Act corrected a lot of the errors of the Constitution. No, it didn't. The Civil Rights Act was a completely new creation. Of course, it was well intended by some. We have acknowledged that many times. But the Civil Rights Act at its core was a new founding. It was the discard what happened prior. The Constitution says people have equal rights. Imagine just treating people equally. The Civil Rights Act does not treat people equally because the legal theory under the Civil Rights Act is disparate impact. And so therefore you can't arrest a bunch of criminals in D.C. because you might be disproportionately arresting black men, and that might be deemed as racist. Stay right there. What do we have, guys? I want to tell you about an event I'm doing, the Culture and Christianity event in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. You guys could check it out right now at alanjackson.com/Charlie. That is alanjackson.com/Charlie. You can also look at the Alan Jackson podcast, which is called Culture and Christianity. Great friend of mine. In every episode, he gives practical things we can do to make a difference. His guests have incredible expertise and powerful testimonies. Go to alanjackson.com/Charlie, alanjackson.com/Charlie. We'll be right back.